Well, hi everyone. Welcome to Inspiring Paths. Today we have a conversation with Kate Strachnyi. She is the founder of Dedicated. Before we get into all of that, just a little bit of housekeeping. The Inspiring Paths series brings data and analytics leaders together with our WIA Corporate Community Manager, Katie Robbert, that's me, to discuss career journeys. These leaders share their insights, challenges, and pivotal moments, offering a glimpse into the diverse avenues of success in the data and analytics field. The series provides valuable guidance for aspiring professionals, showcasing not only technical expertise, but also soft skills and leadership acumen. Through these conversations, viewers gain inspiration and practical knowledge to navigate their own paths in the dynamic world of data and analytics. Join us on the last Tuesday of every month. All the events in this series are free, accessible online, and open to all genders and backgrounds. Participants must abide by the WIA Code of Conduct, which can be accessed in the Women in Analytics website. And if you are having audio issues, please email us at info@womeninanalytics.com. If you have a question for our guest, Kate, today, go ahead and ask away, put it in the Q&A chat box. And if you want to join us for future sessions, follow us on socials, join our newsletter, or tune into the Women in Analytics community platform. So, Kate, thank you for joining us today.
Katie, I'm excited to be here. Kate and Katie, look at that.
I know it's going to be really good. I'm actually really excited because I've been reading up on what you've been doing at Dedicated, and I'm just really excited to dive in. And I know that a lot of our community members, much like you, aren't originally from the United States, and English isn't their first language, but they look to women like you to say, oh, here's what's possible. So, can you give us a little bit of your backstory of, I mean, it's going to be like, tell us your origin story. How did you come to be? So, I really want to know sort of like what your journey kind of looked like and how you came to Dedicated.
Absolutely. And I'll do a very speedy version of it because a lot has happened. But let's start in February. It was a cold winter night. Kate was born
And
in
boom.
Tajikistan, right? So I'm born into a family of, I was the youngest of four children. And basically, we had some personal life issues that led us to think about moving outside of the country. And the United States was one of our options. So it wasn't as easy as let's pack our bags and go to this new country. We had to wait a couple of years. So
Mhm.
fast forward that interesting process of coming to America. I was almost 9 years old when I arrived in New York City, Queens. I still remember seeing Manhattan for the first time because it was December and everything was decorated with like every tree had lights on it. And
Mhm.
I'm like, what is this dream country? Like they're so fancy. We didn't have any of that in Tajikistan. Yeah, little did I know that was going to be replaced with like rats and garbage and homeless people further down the line. But you know, a city is a
Oh,
city.
yeah.
But the funny thing is, when I was in my country, I did not go to school at all. Although the three of my older siblings went to school, I stayed home because we eventually were going to move. So it was sort of like, okay, you're going to go maybe next year if we don't move. And then it's like, oh, what's the point? We're going to move anyways with the hopes of going to this new country. So I didn't really have any understanding of the English language or math. So now I have two kids of my own in the second and fourth grade, and I see what they're working on. And I sort of think back because when I came to the States, I started fourth grade. And at that point, you're doing multiplication, division, you're reading chapter books. And there I was, like A, B, C. And I barely knew the alphabet. So I still remember my mom wanted to put me in kindergarten because she's like, well, she's never been to school. So let's just put her in kindergarten. And the education system is like, no. What year was she born? Okay, she's going to fourth grade because that's how it works. They don't care
Yeah,
what you know, what you don't know. But I
yeah.
think that experience completely transformed the way I look at life because I had to work extra hard, right? Just to get by in school, just to learn the language, just to feel like I belonged in that setting. And I think it took several years, like way after college, for me to feel like I actually caught up, even though I was in honors English by sixth grade and winning the math millionaire or whatever this competition we had on stage. I still remember not knowing English, but winning the math competition on stage. And they're like, oh, it's this Russian schooling you went through. And I'm like, no, I didn't go to school in Russia. I just thought I had to catch up. So that's sort of my journey of getting through childhood. So
It's it's really interesting. And I'm just trying to picture like because fourth grade is what, like 9-ish years old, and 9-year-old Kate sitting in a kindergarten class, just like clapping along to, Old McDonald and everything, and just being
I
like,
wanted to,
what is
Katie.
this country?
You don't understand. I would have loved to. I had a niece. So I became an aunt when I was like 7 years old. Okay. So my niece was going through that kind of baby stuff. And
Uh-huh.
I was like, I understand this. This was great. I was such a confused child. But then I also had this drive for independence. We were not well off, given my
Mhm.
story. I think you can imagine we were not like buying whatever we wanted. And as a kid, you still want things, even though you know you can't afford them. And so I remember going clothes shopping and realizing that we're not going to get me clothes. And that was going to be it. I was 13. And
Mhm.
I know not every kid gets whatever they want, but it was more so in our case. So that's when I realized I'm like, okay, I have to get a job. So
Mhm.
from age 13 until now, I've always worked. I've never had a time where I'm like, let's just say, well, maybe maternity leave if you consider
Sure.
that time off, right? I don't know if that's called time off.
I think you're still working pretty hard.
Yeah, it's questionable. So it sort of pushed me into making money as quick as possible. And I think
Mhm.
that also pushed me to go to college. I finished college in 3 years versus 4 because I took
Wow.
so many classes, every summer class, every winter class that I could get my hands on just to finish a year early to get my first job at 21. So and at that point it was just I think everything was much easier for me after that point because that's when I sort of felt like I belonged a little bit more. I got my
Mhm.
first corporate job and I'm like, I remember getting my first check and like, are they really like, is this legal? They're paying me to sit here. Because from that point, I worked in a bagel shop. I worked as a waitress on tips, right? I had
Mhm.
babysitting gigs, and they did not pay very well. So when I got my first corporate job, and it wasn't a lot, honestly, it was like probably minimum wage at this point, but I was excited. I was just like, wow, I've made it. That was my made it moment.
Well, and it sounds like your journey, of coming from Russia to New York, getting put in a class where you were in over your head, but you really wanted to make the most of it, really lent itself to building this ambition and drive. And you're a founder, you're an author, you've accomplished a lot. So let's fast forward to you sitting maybe in this office job or another job and thinking about starting a company like Dedicated. What does that look like? What was your inspiration point for the company?
Yeah, I think so for the company, I always knew I wanted to have my own business, even through my education system. I used to sell bookmarks to kids and pens that I would buy at a lower price and sell at a higher price. So the
Just
teacher found out
constantly
and said,
hustling.
yeah, then they're like, you can't sell this. I'm like, I'm making good money here. I made like
I
50
love
cents a
that.
bookmark.
So
So I
cool.
always knew I wanted to do that, but I think the breaking point came when I actually had kids. So my
Mhm.
oldest is now 9 years old. So I guess it was about 10 years ago when I realized that I'm going to have this child and then I'm going to have to go back to at that point, I was doing consulting work at one of the big four companies. Again, one of like my biggest dreams, but that dream could sometimes be not a dream, could turn into, I don't want to say a nightmare, but when you want to see your children grow up and you have to travel all the time, it just, there's conflict of
Mhm.
desires at that point. So I remember trying to look for at least a work from home job, which did end up working for a couple of years. But I always had this drive to do my own thing. Not because I want to be just making, a lot of money, which of course that is part of the drive. There's no guarantee that you'll make a lot of money in your own business, but more so I wanted the flexibility to do things when I want to do them, how I want to do them. And I think the kids truly inspired that because I'm like, I want to be available to go to whatever show they have, volunteer at whatever thing they have in school. Like this morning, my 7-year-old said, I think I'm sick. She's not sick, by the way. She's just like playing games. Um, She's like, I think I want to stay home. And I think I'm sick. I'm like, well, stay home then. Like, I wasn't even in school at this age. You'll be fine. Like, she's been reading chapter books since she was 5. She's good. So I emailed her teacher and I'm like, yeah, she'll stay home. And I was explaining to her, I'm like, it's because I have this flexibility to work around my own schedule. And that was my biggest dream for having my own company.
And I love that. I mean, it's such an interesting perspective, because I know a lot of my other friends have kids, and when their kids are like, "I wanna stay home," they're like, "No, you're going." And you're like, "I wasn't even in school yet. I didn't speak English. It's fine." And it's such an interesting perspective, and I feel like we could talk about that for the entire hour,
Yeah.
but I know that a lot of our community members are wondering about, the company itself. Like, where did you get the idea for your company?
Okay, so I never actually set out to do this. And I think that happens to a lot of people. Like I wasn't sitting there
Yeah.
planning, I'll start this media company. So for those unfamiliar with it, Dedicated is a media company, and it sort of means dedicated to data, and it's got the sound of my name, Kate, in there. So that was the story with the name. I still don't remember exactly when or how I actually came up with that, but I do know I did come up with it. And I had the trademark and I own it because I
That's
love that
good.
name. So what happened was when I was transitioning from my consulting gig into the work from home gig, which was a data insight strategy manager role, I had to
Mhm,
learn a tool called Tableau. Most of
mhm.
the audience might be familiar with that. It's a data visualization platform. And as I learned, I used to post things on LinkedIn like, hey, audience, I'm learning Tableau. Do you have any tips? Or I'm taking a certification exam. Do you have any tips? And I got a little bit of engagement, and that sort of kept me coming back and posting. So as I learned more about data science, data analytics, I would post it. And that grew into a following. Now, I loved doing what we're doing right now. I loved talking to people because I remember thinking, maybe I want to be a data scientist. So let me talk to data scientists. And I think it's such an untapped market where you can just go and talk to people for free. Like, just go and do it. If you ask 10 people, at least 2 will say yes. I promise you, right? So I started talking to people and I started a show called Humans of Data Science, just showing people at all different levels. And the reason the company was born is because eventually marketing people and founders of companies, CMOs, CTOs of companies that have a data story to tell, they started to contact me and say, hey, Kate, how do we get my founder or CEO on your show? Like, how much is it? And I'm like, huh, how much is it? Hmm, how much do
Interesting.
you think it is? Like, and then I'm like, great, that is the right price for it. I love it. Let's get him on the show. So that's sort of where I got the idea. I'm like, people are willing to pay because now I had this audience of people who love data and want to learn about this. And I love talking to people. And now people want to pay me to do this. So it's sort of a no-brainer to branch out and do this full time. And the best decision I ever made. That's my favorite. Yeah.
I mean, it's so interesting. I work with a lot of data scientists. My co-founder is a data scientist, and it's very challenging to find the right platform for them to tell their story. And so I love that you have this because it is such an important vehicle for people to, get out there and talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, everything they're working on, but to do it in a way that you're reaching the right audience because there's a lot of people who are just trying to like reach any audience and it just kind of goes out into the void and into the
Yeah.
ether. And so I love that, you've created this, and I love the story about the name too. I think that
Thank
that's
you.
really fantastic.
Thank you.
Um, well, so let's talk a little bit about data visualization. And so you have a book as well,
Mhm.
color wise. And so I love Tableau. I think it's a fantastic tool. I think it's a lot of fun. And I think that a lot of data scientists and analysts struggle with the other side of analytics, which is the storytelling part. Like they can do the numbers, they can put the information together, and then it kind of stops there. They rely on other people to put the pieces together. So talk a little bit about how you came up with the idea for writing color wise and what sort of what the need was in the market for it.
Yeah, so funny story. I don't know if there was a need because I remember I involve my audience into everything I do. So I'm like, hey, I'm thinking to write a book. what do you guys think? Or they actually picked the title. Like I did a poll about different titles, and this was the one that won. So I tried to take everyone on the journey with me, which is so much more fun than doing it alone.
Mhm.
But I self-published several books before. Parts of them were just interviews with other data scientists called Journey to Data Scientist. One was The Disruptors, another one Mothers of Data Science, another one for kids. But I wanted to work with a publisher. So that was my goal. And I've always been passionate about visual best practices. So if we go back to when I was learning Tableau, part of what I really wanted to focus on was making the visuals look just a little bit better every time. And
Mhm.
my managers at the time, they were noticing, like, Kate, I don't know what it is you're doing, but it looks better every time I look at it. And part of that was just reducing clutter, making sure the story comes through, and applying visual best practices, just thought principles and all that good stuff. My favorite aspect was color, and I think you can make such a transformation with proper use of color. Now, I noticed that there were many books out there in data visualization, data storytelling, where color was maybe a chapter or a section of a chapter. And I'm like, okay, maybe I should write a book. There isn't one out there. So when there isn't one out there, two things can happen. One, no one cares, or two, no one did it yet. So
Mhm.
I was hopeful that no one did it yet and people cared. So I spoke to a couple of publishers, and I remember talking to O'Reilly about it, and they're like, we don't know if it's big enough. Like, why don't you do a data visualization book? Or why don't you do a Tableau book or something different? So I left, I talked to other publishers, and then I decided I'll just write this thing myself. But then I remember speaking at an O'Reilly event about visual best practices, and the event was so engaging that they came back and they're like, hey, do you still want to write this book? And I'm like, I am writing this book. So they actually agreed to use the title that I had as well. And long story short, that's why it came to be with O'Reilly. But the need itself, I think it's such an overlooked aspect of data visualization and storytelling, because like you mentioned, data scientists are great at getting it almost to the end, almost to the finishing line. And they call data visualization and storytelling the last mile of analytics. And I
Mhm.
actually did a talk at Big Data London last year called the last inch of data analytics, because if data viz is the last mile, and the right color, intentional use of color is that last inch. I had some mixed reviews on that title, so I went with it anyways. It's memorable, right?
I like it.
2.54 centimeters, apparently, is an inch, because I had to translate it to the London audience. So that's sort of why I wrote it, but it was very well received by the data visualization audience, and I do think it filled a need that was out there.
I'm gonna make my co-founder, who's our data scientist, read this book because every time I look at the charts he puts together, they are, and I've said this to him, they are hands down the ugliest thing I've ever seen. He likes bright neon colors. He thinks that's visually appealing. It hurts my soul. And I feel like if I can hand him your book, then I can have a leg to stand on to say, we need to do this differently. It's just not resonating. Um, what would be if you could summarize just one thing that analysts and data scientists could do to improve their data storytelling, where would you have them start?
Right. If we're still focusing on color, I would just say the one thing that you could do is whatever your system, either R, Python, Tableau, whatever
Mhm.
you're using to create your visuals, whatever the default settings are, just they might be good, but just sort of remove them, go to grayscale mode, and think about what color do I need, being intentional. It's in the title of the full title of the book. The key here is
Mhm.
to be intentional, not to just go with the colors that were already there, but think about why. If you're making it red, why are you making it red? If you're making it black, why? And think
Mhm.
about that. But if we talk about storytelling in a broader sense, I would say the most important thing, and this ties into color as well, is to know your audience. Who are you actually delivering this to, presenting this to? Who's going to stumble upon it? Who's going to see it? It goes back to being intentional. But when you're designing it, knowing what your audience knows and what they don't know, and making sure you're not dumbing things down too much or going in a really advanced way at the same time. So finding that balanced approach of speaking directly to your audience and using their language.
I love that, and, you know, the intention is such a big part of it, and so I'm actually gonna start asking those questions of, what was your intention with choosing this canary yellow that is making my eyes hurt, or this neon green, that nobody can see because it just bleeds out. And so and I'm sort of picking on him a little bit, but I really think it's gonna open up the conversation to
And
help him stop and think like, "Oh, what was my intention? Was it just available, or is there actually a meaning behind it?"
yes, and I mean, one more thing I'll add here is there are, I think, 1 in 8 men are colorblind or
Mm.
have color vision deficiency. So it could be that he's seeing a totally different color than what you're seeing, which is a whole other ballgame. But then,
So when are you writing that book?
oh, there's a chapter on color vision deficiency in this book that shows why you should think about people who are colorblind. Because if you use red and green, for example, it looks
Mhm,
almost exactly the same to somebody who suffers from this specific form of a color vision deficiency. But in addition to just picking the right colors, I think there's even more to it, right? If you have a dashboard with, let's say, 3 or 4 charts that are talking about similar things, like they're all talking about 3 different regions, and you're coloring the region in a bar chart this color, and then you're changing the color of that same region in the next chart,
mhm.
that's just going to confuse people. And it blows my mind. I think that is my biggest pet peeve. When I see that, just why? I shake it. I'm like, why do you do that? So that's a big part of why I wrote the book. I'm hoping people will read it and actually just use it intentionally. Like, oh, the West region was blue here. Let's keep it that same exact blue over here so people can tie it together.
Mhm,
Or don't use that color for something else, because then they will tie it together, because that's what humans do. We see two of the same things and we think they belong together. So
and it sounds so straightforward, but yet somehow we all just were doing it wrong, and so I love that this is really that you focused your book on this specific topic because, you know, it when as you're speaking, I think about, a more global audience and maybe someone who doesn't speak the same language as you is just trying to see what the chart says, and they need to be able to understand it without being able to understand all of the language and narrative around it.
yeah.
And I think that that's just so important, and color is a universal language.
Absolutely. It does evoke emotion, right? So you have an immediate reaction when you see something, let's say bright red in the Western culture, we think, okay, something bad has happened. But
Mhm,
if you're delivering to an Asian culture, ooh, something good has happened. So there is that difference as well. So if you are
mhm,
talking to a global culture, there are some colors that you should stick to that are sort of safe if you don't want to evoke that much emotion. It's like black, blue, gray, staying away from the more vibrant colors that have actual meaning attached to them.
mhm. No, and that's so smart, I love that. I'm excited to give him this book and gift him this book. Um, so you've talked a lot about your audience and your community. Can you talk a little bit about how you've built that and how you engage them in your career journey? Because, as we're talking with the women in analytics community, a lot of them are wondering, how can I make the most of a community and why is it so important?
Building an actual community is so hard. So I feel for you guys who are running communities. I had my story sort of for dedicated kept shifting, and I'm sure it'll keep shifting in the future. Because when I started this as a dedicated academy. I had
Mhm,
courses on Tableau, Power BI. I hired other people to create courses. I did some visual best practices. And then actually transformed that into something I call dedicated circle. See, the beauty, I guess, of running your own thing is you can keep changing it every day if you want. No one's
it's
gonna
true.
say, Kate, calm down. So I do have that problem where I'm like, ooh, I had this idea. Okay, let's execute right now. And that's it. No one to run it by. And then I sort of shifted the focus into media and focusing most of my efforts into the media strategy. But the way I engaged my community was the same way I guess you would engage someone on a platform like LinkedIn or a social media
Mhm,
platform similar to that. When somebody asks a question, you try to answer it. If you can't answer it, you get other people to try and answer it. And I think in this specific community, helping each other should be the goal. And I think if you, for example, don't know an answer to something, but you know somebody who can help, sort of being that connector is so powerful because you can bring people together. And I used to do that naturally just because I love helping people. And now I see all the things that I've connected. It actually just feels really good to go out there and help. But as members of the community, I say just go out of your way and just be as helpful as possible, interact, engage, leave comments, ask questions. If you have the opportunity, then why not take advantage of it?
No, and that makes a lot of sense, and I think that, there's a lot of members are more lurkers and just sort of watching, and I feel like if we can encourage them to ask questions and participate, they'll get so much more out of it, and you're a great example of what that looks like. You've talked about how your community helped you name your book. Should you write a book? They said yes, and they've been with you every step of the way, and so it's a really empowering thing for you.
Yeah, I actually a couple of years ago I ran a poll on LinkedIn asking people if they were if they identify themselves as a consumer of content or producer of content. This was
Mhm.
on LinkedIn. So 97 or some percent said, can you guess? They were consumers.
Consumers.
Yes, about 3% were producers. And I spoke to someone earlier this week actually, and she's like, I still remember that poll, and basically that was the triggering point for her to start
Mhm.
posting more because she's
Mhm.
like, I have something to say. And a lot of folks who are maybe shy about putting themselves out there or think, what do I have to add to this conversation? Like I'm just starting out, and so many people have said this ahead, before me. To them, I want to just say that you have a unique perspective. You have your own journey that you went on. And I think sharing that perspective, like through your lens, what you're working on, what you're learning, what you're seeing, what questions you have, that's sort of what makes the community a community. If we were all just sitting and lurking, I mean, what would be the good of that? Yeah, we can't all be sharing content at the same time either, but I think shifting that percentage of maybe
Mhm.
90-10 instead of 97-3 is already going to be helpful. So just raise your hand, ask a question, or just help somebody who asks a question ahead of you.
And I think you're absolutely right. We just need to get more involved. And so, you've mentioned your journey, and so you've said you used to work for as a consultant. Was data and analytics always your focus, or were there other things that you tried first in your career? A little while back in a different episode of Inspiring Paths, we talked with Celia Wanderley, and she mentioned this idea of micropaths. And so they're not so it's not that she took steps that didn't lead her forward. She just took micropaths that maybe spurred off and then she came back and kept going. So, do you have examples of those micropaths that you took that you're like, I tried it, it's not for me, or has it always been one directional?
Well, I realized I don't want to be a waitress when I was one, right? So
Fair.
I went to college for a finance degree. That was the goal.
Okay.
And my whole mission was to get a job in finance. I know it's super vague, generic. I still don't know what I even meant when I said that. But when I graduated, it was 2009. And for
Okay.
those who know, they know it was a financial crisis.
A little bit.
All the banks were at a hiring freeze. And boy, I wanted to work at a bank. I don't know why. I think I heard they make money, so I'm like, ooh, finance, banks, me. No, okay, no one's hiring. Great. So what I did was I went to as many networking events as I could. And
Mhm.
I just spoke to everybody, like, hey, I'm looking for a job, I'm graduating in a month, and blah, blah, blah. Um, I ended up getting hired for a business development representative for a risk management training company. Totally not what I was looking for, but that was my first corporate check, as I
Okay.
mentioned, and whew, I was excited. I'm like, I could do this. It involved going and selling, so I would actually go to chief risk officers, completely different path again, and try to sell them. What happened was I met a chief risk officer who wanted to hire me because he's like,
Mhm.
oh, you look like you really love this stuff. Let's, bring you in as a risk analyst. Again, very far from what I'm doing now. Another shift. When I was learning about risk management, I didn't know much. So I started a risk blog, and I would just, anything I learned, I would try to put it in simple terms, any regulations that came out. And the Deloitte actually saw my blog and they contacted me, one of their recruiters. And they're like, hey, do you want to do consulting? I was like, me? the little girl from Tajikistan who doesn't speak English at Deloitte? What? And they're like, yeah, come in for an interview. And they're like, it's going to be a lot of travel. And I'm like, oh my God, travel? You're going to pay me to travel? I was so excited. So I went in for the interview, couple of rounds, not easy to interview, but I ended up getting the job. And that sort of was another micropath. And then again, not in data. I was a regulatory compliance risk management consultant for banks.
Hmm.
So kept shifting around. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the kids led to me looking for a work from home gig, which ended up randomly being a data insight strategy role. I have
Mhm.
not touched data before that or had any interest in it, but I went full force because I'm like, this job is keeping me home. I get to see my child. I'll do whatever it takes. So that was my reason for going full force. But I've never been happier than I am working at Dedicated with my media company, my little big baby.
No, and it sounds like it, and it's really interesting because the thing that seems like is a bit of a common thread with your journey is that I'm sure there was some fear and insecurities involved somewhere, but it sounds like you've really said to yourself, like, "You know what? I'm just gonna try." And because that sort of shows that's what I'm seeing as someone on the outside of, "Here's an opportunity, great, I'm gonna try it. Here's another thing, great, I'm gonna try it." And I think that that's so important because a lot of times, especially as women, we lead with fear of, "Oh, I don't know if I can do that," or "I don't know if, I'm right for that." But when Deloitte contacted you, you were like, "Okay, let me give it a shot."
Yeah, I had nothing to lose, but when you talk about fears, oh, absolutely. So many fears and so much doubt and so much why me and should I even do this, especially early on, even posting content or being on a podcast. I still
Mhm.
remember my first podcast where it was off camera. I had notes written up I was going to read. And the guy interviewing me, he was just like a recent college grad and he wanted to interview me. And I was so nervous. I started sending him an email like, oh, I can't do it. I have a conflict, insert excuse here, sort of thing. But I sort of got over it. I'm like, just do it. What's the worst that will happen?
Mhm.
Um, and nothing bad happened. It only led to other people wanting to have me on the podcast because they heard me on his podcast and they're like, and then I did another one and it absolutely gets easier no matter what you're doing. It gets easier with every single time.
And now you get to do it for other people and
Yeah.
provide that platform. And
Yes.
so, what have been some of your favorite interviews, or what are some of the things and stories and insights that you've gotten from hosting your own podcast?
Oh my God, there were so many. Let's see. I think what ended up happening is some of the people I met through these podcasts ended up being real life friends, meaning we became friends after the fact because we learned so much about each other. We have so much in common. Um, so some of the people I interviewed are like absolute rock stars, like Bernard Marr, for example, Kirk Bourne, like, the
Mhm.
data rock stars, the famous people. I interviewed two actually child prodigies. One
Wow.
Michael Wimmer, he was on the Ellen DeGeneres show,
Oh,
and
yep.
he was just like, I never know if I'm saying her last name right. That's why I hesitated.
Ellen
So
DeGeneres, yeah.
yeah, okay, I said it right. I
You
see the
did.
words in my head. I'm like, am I saying this right? Yeah, he was like an 11-year-old college student. Like it was
Wow.
the opportunities to just talk to all these awesome people was great. Um, and I think I got something out of every conversation. It was either an inspiration for me to do something, an action to take, a new thing I learned, a new program to use, a new tool to look into. You always get something out of these conversations.
Um, and I think that it's so essential for all of us to step outside of our, little circle, our companies, to not just to network, but just to connect with other people. Because to your point, you're getting new information, and I think that that's the power of a community. That's the power of a podcast, and I love that you are spearheading bringing that to your audience, bringing that to people, creating those spaces where people can learn more than just their little, I'm in this lane, this is what I do.
Yeah, and I think even more importantly, I do most of these things live. So I actually
Mhm.
engage. So if, let's say, I have a really interesting speaker on, all of my audience members can potentially ask a question in the live chat. So if they ever wanted to have a question, Q&A time with the speaker, I try to take as many live questions from the audience as possible to make that individual even more accessible to the rest of the community. makes my job easier too, because I'm like, hey, this is the question the audience wants to know, so let's go with that one.
No, I think it's so amazing. That's such a great approach to it. One of the things that I heard about you that if this is true, I'm impressed. Are you an ultra marathoner?
I have run ultra marathons.
Ooh.
I got into running probably around the same time I was having kids, because I don't know if you're aware, but your body changes when you're having kids.
Just a little bit,
And
just
I'm
the
like,
tiniest bit.
someone told me the body you have before you have your first child is the body you're going to bounce back to. So I'm like, okay, so maybe I should run. And I remember my brother was running half marathons. And I was telling him, like, hey, do you have nothing better to do in your life? Like, why are you wasting your life running 13.1 miles? And then that same year, I got so into it. I'm like, hey, let's run a marathon. So I basically made him sign up for a marathon with me in like 2018. And then he ran a couple of ultras with me as well. He's like, how do you flip from telling me I don't, have a good use of my time to now doing ultras? But the ultras I did were more self-created. I did a couple of official ones where we have the timer and everything,
Mhm.
but I wanted to do it as an exploration. So one of them was running the perimeter of Manhattan.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so it's 36 plus something miles, and anything over 26 miles is considered an ultra. So that one worked. So that was probably my favorite, because it was just, you see so many different things. In the perimeter. I
Mhm.
have a video about that one. So
I mean, that's really impressive. I'm a cyclist, I can't run. I can cycle 36 miles, but I can barely run a mile. And so anytime I hear that someone's a runner, I just don't have the legs for it. I I'm really impressed. And it sort of to me, it very nicely ties back into everything else we've talked about of like your ambitions and, really wanting to challenge yourself because I mean, running a marathon is not an easy task, let alone running an ultra marathon or running, however many miles. And so, have you found that that kind of training, has helped you sort of think through other things in your career? Like, how do the two kind of go together for you?
in more ways than one. So I think the first way, it would be the fact that you have to keep at it to follow through to get to the goal. So whether it was training to run a marathon without injury, which means you actually have to run a lot before the actual marathon. Um, Being consistent with showing up. Yes, you can skip a day or so, but if you skip more than half the training days, chances are you're not going to be really good on the run. And the other way, it actually tied in 2021, I think. TCS, the sponsor of New York City Marathon, actually sponsored me to run the New York City Marathon.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I got paid to run, which was like, oh my God, I'm not a fast runner, by the way. I think most people can walk faster than my running, and no joke. Like, I if you look over here, you probably won't see it, but that's like a plaque that they sent me.
Mhm.
It says my fastest marathon time is 4 hours and 51 minutes. Most people I know who run marathons, they're like sad if they don't make it in 3 hours. Okay. I was
Oh
happy
my
to make it under
goodness.
5. So I would never go for speed. I always liked the longer distance, the avoid
Mhm.
injury and have fun along the way. I'm like high-fiving all the little kids along the way and stopping to make little videos. But they hired me to sort of tell the story of training for the marathon and tying it in with data analytics and some training charts and all that good stuff. So I haven't run that much this year, but I am planning to get back into it soon.
Well, and you mentioned that it's really about consistency, and I think that's true of anything. So when you started writing your risk blog, you were consistently posting, even if you weren't really sure what the thing was. You were using that as your way to learn. You
Yeah,
consistently engage with your audience. You consistently, try to keep up and learn new things when you're interviewing your audience. And so it seems like that's a big theme in your life is,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, even like if people who want to grow a following on social media platform, again, goes back to consistently putting out valuable content without really thinking too much about the end goal. Like not focusing on, okay, 100 more posts until I make it. Like, no, you're
Mhm.
going to be doing posts until you can't do posts no more. Like you just keep going. And then there was definitely that overlap with running because I never trained just for the marathon. I trained because I wanted to keep running marathons in the future and continue to be able to do that. And plus, I had fun with it. So whatever you find fun, it's so much easier to be consistent. I think most people don't have an issue with watching Netflix, right? Like being consistent with your shows that you're in love with. Imagine saying, "Oh man, I just couldn't do it anymore. Like, got sick of it." So finding that thing you actually enjoy makes it so much easier. So if you're not into running and you like cycling, then do that. Like no one says you
Mhm.
have to run. I like cycling too, by the way.
Yeah.
I
I've tried running. It's just I'm not built for it. It's not for me. I
It's
keep
not for
trying it.
everyone. Some people
Yeah.
dread it. I actually liked it. Like I would wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning to do it. So
Wow.
yeah.
That I mean, I'm impressed by that.
You're like,
Um,
no, I'm not doing
no.
it.
I mean, I'll get up that early to cycle, but definitely not to run.
You see, because you like cycling.
I do, yeah. So what else are you working on? So, you have dedicated, but you have more books, you have more podcasts, you have other projects. What else are you working on that, you're really excited about?
Yeah, so there are lots of things. In addition to just dedicated as a media company, I've actually started to expand that into something I call Dedicated Plus, where I now work with over 25 other influencers who want to
Mhm,
do this kind of work, basically putting them in touch with clients who maybe don't want to work with 20 different influencers one by one, but want to hire them in one shot. Like if they have
mhm,
a big product launch coming up and they want 20 people to talk about it on social media, I sort of help facilitate that process. And that's my attempt at scale because Dedicated is a team of me, myself, and AI, not
mm,
I.
mhm,
ChatGPT helps me a lot. In addition to the media work, I am working on launching a new program called Dedicated Brandification Program, which is for now it's an 8-week program that might change later this year when I get feedback from my first trial members. But essentially, a program for people who want to grow their personal brand, focused on leaders in the data analytics and AI machine learning space. Typically, you have these founders or C-suite executives that are so focused on their startup, their little company or their big company in some cases, that they put all their time and effort into that, and eventually either something goes really wrong and they lose the company, or something goes really right and they sell the company. But either way, they end up back to square one, sort of like, hey, I did this thing, but what about me? So I help
mhm,
them shift that focus on building their own personal brand that is a little bit separate from just the company. We can still help the company, but sort of focus on the individual as well. So teaching them, how do you engage with content? How do you build relationships? How do you, commenting on people's posts, and the tools that I use that they can use to speed up that process of content creation. So really excited about that one. It involves coaching and live sessions with them as well. So it's very different than what I'm used to doing, but I have 4 people going through the trial right now, and I just love the environment for now. Let's see how it goes. It's new, so that's all I know about it for now.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about that. Again, there's such a need for it, um, because artificial intelligence is making it easier for people to create content, but not making it easier for people to create good quality content. And it's
Yeah.
not replacing that human connection. If anything, it's driving us farther away from making human connection. So I really love that you're, helping people refocus on that aspect of it and not just getting buried deep within their company.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I can usually tell if a post was created by AI. It's usually very obvious. Even if they take the time to massage it a little bit, I could still tell, like, that's not the language this person uses or any person
Mhm.
uses. This is AI language. And I know we'll get to a point where it's going to be even harder to detect, but the more we can remain authentic and human, especially in this age of generative AI content flooding the gates, the easier it is to stand out and actually showcase your personal brand.
I wholeheartedly agree. That is
Yeah.
really gonna be the big differentiators for, many leaders, many people in general.
Yeah.
Just as a friendly reminder for our attendees of the webinar today, if you have questions for Kate, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we will, have Kate answer them. And I guess one last question from me is if you could go back and give younger Kate any advice, what would you give her?
Um, do what makes you happy. I actually have a sign right there. You don't see it, but my best friend gave it to me. It says do what you love. I think focusing in on doing the things that you love and not thinking too much about what are people going to say or what are people going to think if I do these things, because at the end of the day, they really don't care, and their opinions really don't matter. I think many times we give so much value to other people's opinions, and I forget whose quote this was, but it was something along the lines of, if that's not the person you want to become, then why are you taking their criticism so harshly, right? Like, if
Mhm,
that's not who you want to be anyways, then why bother giving them so much credit? As long as the thing you love is not harming others, do the thing that you
mhm.
love.
No, and I think that that's as we grow in our careers, I think that's so important. I know I struggled with that as well, thinking that people were paying too close attention or criticizing, and I, like you, had to come to the realization that nobody cares, and it's not that they
Yeah,
don't care,
yeah.
but it's that we all are so focused on other things that to give that kind of credit and power to other people is really not helpful to us as individuals.
Yeah, I remember some of my first posts that I made on social media. I was worried, who's going to see this and what they're going to think. And oh my God, what if like three people see this? And then I very quickly realized that the struggle is, how do I actually get people to look at what I'm posting? Because there's so much out there that you're actually fighting for the attention, the eyeballs. Because you're right, people care about themselves, and a lot of times, like I talk to a lot of people who struggle with the fear of posting something or a video,
Mhm,
especially. And I'm like, okay, what's the worst thing that will happen? They're like, okay, for most people, women especially, they're like, my coworkers will see this.
mm.
And like, who cares? Like, you're posting, you're talking about. I think this is about like data transformation projects, and you're being very generic about it. So you're not giving away any information. You're not doing anything illegal or wrong.
Mhm,
Okay, what do you think your coworker is going to think? Oh, I don't know. They'll probably think nothing. They'll probably. I'm like, what? What are they very likely to do? They'll probably keep scrolling, because guess what? Not their whole life is not about watching everything you produce. They're not just
mhm.
gonna sit and watch your 40-minute video. Like, oh my God, can you believe she said that? Like, no, they're gonna keep scrolling to find something else if they're not interested in this. Or chances are they're gonna think you're smart and you know what you're talking about on this topic. So
Mhm,
the person I'm talking about still is not posting, so I have not done my job correctly because she still has that fear. But whoever else is listening, and if you have that fear, you'll notice that your first 5 posts might feel a little awkward or uncomfortable. But if that's something that you want to move forward with in terms of building your personal brand, especially on
mhm.
social media, the sixth post will definitely be easier. And you'll even start to make some friends who are engaging with your content, who like your content. Yeah, it's like a snowball effect, and you'll just keep doing it.
It's that consistency that you keep talking about, it seems like
Yes.
just a really strong thread.
Yes, absolutely.
Sarah asks, what advice do you have for someone who is more senior level in analytics and is thinking about what to do next? Do you have a suggestion on how to explore what might be the right fit for you?
I think doing some analysis of what you actually enjoy about your role and thinking through why you want to take that next step and which direction you want to take it in, because it goes back to your personality, right? Some people love, for example, managing a team, right? So if you think your next role is managing a team and you like to help people with their personal development goals, with their touch points and one-on-ones and making sure that they succeed, then maybe going into that specific role is good for you. And I think some people are pressured into that. They're like, oh, that's the next level. You have to be a manager, you have to grow a team, but it is not for everybody. It's because some people like to be a solo contributor or individual contributor, right? Where they want to manage their own process, their own team. I mean, their own project, not team. So I think doing some internal work and deciding what it is that actually makes you happy. And in other cases, you might be ready to venture out and maybe do your own thing completely, where you've learned all these skills and you have all this experience that you might want to take a year or two and do some consulting and work with some of your favorite clients where you're running the whole show. So it goes back to knowing what you actually enjoy and even being grateful that you're in the opportunity to decide, right? A lot of people would love to be in that situation where like, oh, I already have this cool job and now I'm thinking about what's next. So do some thinking. Writing helps me, like writing down all the pluses and minuses of the different opportunities that I can go with.
I had a friend who did that. We used to work together at a tech company, and she was on a senior level, and she did that. She wrote down everything she liked, she didn't like, and she ended up leaving the industry altogether to become a postpartum doula. And it's one of my favorite stories to tell because it's such a departure. So we worked in tech, she was a PMO manager, and we always thought the next level was going to be director or VP. And that was the natural progression.
Yeah.
But when she actually sat down of what am I passionate about? What do I enjoy? She became a postpartum doula and left it all together. And it's such an amazing story about how your career doesn't have to be look any one certain way. It really is, to your point, what you've been saying, do what makes you happy.
Yeah. And you mentioned natural progression. There shouldn't even be a thing like that, right? Like there should be no
Mhm.
natural progression. You're supposed to pick your own path. Although you see the flow of people like, okay,
Sure.
80% of people who are at this point, they ended up doing that. And you do feel that pressure sometimes to go ahead and do that. Like
Mhm.
back in my consulting days, when I left, I was a manager, but sort of the progression would be to become a senior manager and then a partner. And then once your
Mhm.
partner, you've made it and you're working all the time, but you've made it, right? And I actually had to take a step back because when you're in that situation, you're sort of drinking the juice or the water, the Kool-Aid is what people say,
Mhm.
right? You're drinking that Kool-Aid and
Yes.
you're like, okay, next step is this. That's all I see. Tunnel vision, that's my goal. But taking us, and I think the kids sort of broke that pattern for me because like, okay, I I have options. I don't have to do this path. I can take a separate path. Um, and it could end up something that you like or something you don't. But I remember thinking about the fact that I can always come back if I truly hate this
Mhm.
path I took. It's not a one-way street. You can come back and you can go that path if that's what you choose, or go a completely different one. It's the beauty of the environment these days where we could move around and become anything that we want to become.
I love that, and I think that that's a really great place for us to start to wrap up. Kate, I loved this conversation. You're so much fun. You have so much information to share, such great expertise. Any final thoughts for the women in analytics community?
First of all, thank you, Katie. I actually had a blast. So thank you so much for being a great host, and I loved all the questions you had. I think the final thing is take advantage of the community that you have. You've obviously joined this community for a specific reason. Think back to when you were clicking the join button. Some of these communities are so easy to join that you join and then don't even do anything. But I think taking advantage of the resources, the webinars, engaging in conversations like these, consuming the content that people spend their time putting together, and just taking advantage of more opportunities and like engaging with each other. You're in this community, you're a network, leverage that. Talk to each other. I'm shocked at how many people don't talk to each other. Like you're there together. It's like when people go to an event and they only talk to the people they know. Like,
Mhm.
why are you here? Go talk to them at home.
For the free food.
Yeah. No, but you know what I mean? Like
I
branch
do, yes.
out, talk to people you maybe didn't talk to before, because you will get something out of that conversation, or maybe you'll help them get something out of that conversation. And it
Mhm.
really feels good to help. So that's it for me.
I love it. Well, I'm going to go engage with you on LinkedIn. I can't wait to see what you do next, and I'm going to send your book to my data scientist. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you, Kate.